Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another video in the Minestom Minecraft server development series. In this video, I'm going to teach you guys about permissions. Alright guys, welcome back. So if you know anything about Minecraft servers, when you try running a command, sometimes it'll let you, sometimes it won't. And that's usually guided by a thing called a permission. So if a player on the server has that permission, they can do something. If they don't have the permission, they cannot do something. A permission is just a string that's completely made up by the server owner. So if you want to make a permission that guards the game mode command, you can make a permission just called game mode if you want to, or you could do something like commands dot game mode. And the dot is a way of giving your permissions some hierarchy. So if you have multiple command permissions, you could do commands dot TP, commands dot die or something like that. These are all just completely made up permissions by the server owner. And even though these permissions are completely made up, the cool thing about having this hierarchy here, where you have these different command permissions that all sort of come from the commands base permission, is that if you give a player the commands dot star permission, this little star here is known as a wildcard, meaning that they inherit all permissions automatically from this. So if these are the four permissions that we have on our server, if they have commands dot star as their permission, then they will automatically have these three permissions here because they all start with commands dot. So these are completely made up, but let's just say you have a MMO server, you have commands, and you have commands on your server, but then you specifically have MMO related commands. So that means that if you want to give a player all of the MMO commands on the server, you could just do MMO.star. So that will give them access to all of these commands, but if they have something like commands.potato, they will not be given access to this potato permission because the permission does not start with MMO. So hopefully that makes sense. I think it's a pretty simple concept, but you can make up these permissions however you want to. But the cool thing is that you can also use the wildcard here to give them access to all parts of a certain level of permissions, okay? So also if they had the star permission just by itself, this would of course give them access to every single permission on the server because there's nothing before it, nothing after it. So they would just sort of get everything, okay? Anyway, so that's how permissions work in Minecraft if you weren't aware previously. And again, we can use these to protect access to certain things like commands. That's probably the most common use case. But literally anything on the server, breaking blocks, anything that can happen. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is show you guys how you can check permissions on a Minestorm server. Let's just do this on our weapon command that we already have here. So basically we can make it so that the player has access to the weapon command if they have the permission. If they don't have the permission, they don't have access. Pretty simple, right? So there's different ways you can do this, of course. The first way that you can do is if they run the command, first you check to see if they're a player. If they are a player, then you can go ahead and do player.hasPermission. And then to this, you can pass in either a string permission name or the permission object itself. So what we can do is if player.hasPermission, and just go ahead and negate this. So if they don't have permission, send the player a message. You do not have permission to run this command. And then we'll just return after that so it does not run any more code. And then we want to actually specify the permission that we're trying to check. Again, you can either provide the string permission name or the actual permission object. I don't think it really matters which one. I'm just going to go and do the first one just because why not? So you can do new permission. And now the permission is just that made up thing that I showed you before. So we're just going to call our permission game mode. So if they have a permission called game mode, they can run the command. If they do not, it will send this message and return. All right. Okay, this is me from the future. I don't know why I just named it game mode. That doesn't make any sense. It should be called weapon because this is the weapon command, not the game mode command. So of course, give it a permission name that sort of corresponds to the command that you're working with because that makes sense. So one thing we need to do is actually register the command because we unregistered it at some point. So I'll just go down here and do Minecraft server.getCommandManager.register new weapon command, just like that. And now let's go ahead and test it out. Okay, back in the server now, so we'll do /weapon. And boom, it says you do not have permission to run this command. And that's because obviously I have not been given the permission. So yeah, we're using Minestom, so there's no built-in way to give a player permissions. That is something that you have to come up with yourself. In traditional Minecraft servers, you would have a plugin, like a permissions plugin such as luck perms, that could help you assign players permissions and set up groups and stuff like that. But with Minestom, of course, we don't have that. So we just got to come up with a way to give a player permission. And to do that, what I'm going to do is make two commands. First, let's make a sub package called just permissions. We're going to make one command called add permission and then another command called remove permission. So that way we can test permissions in our server, okay? So if a player runs this command, first of all, we want to make sure that they run the command properly. So set default executor, and we want to say sender.sendMessage usage/add permission, and then the permission name. And we want to specify that argument, so permission arg is equal to argument type dot string permission. So what that should do is make it so that whenever you run slash add permission, we can grab the permission as a string. And then now what we can do is add it to the player by doing player.add permission. And now it expects a permission object, so we know how to do that. Just new permission, and then we can just pass in the name. And that's it. That's literally how you add a permission to a player. So now that the player has the permission, we can just, send a message saying permission added successfully, just so we can have a little bit of feedback. All right, and that's it. So this should allow us to add a permission to a player. Okay, we have registered our command. Let's go and test it out and see if we can add a permission to our player. So let's go and do slash add permission weapon. And then we can do slash weapon now, and boom, it says a weapon has been added to your inventory because we have given ourselves the proper permission to be able to run the command, which is great. One thing I want to show you real quick is if we go back to our weapon command here, we are checking if the player has permission after they run the command. So when it already reaches our default executor, we're checking to see if it's a player and then checking the permission. But the cool thing is that Minestom has a built-in way to set conditions on a command. So we can do set condition. And now it's asking for a command condition, which is just a functional interface. So we can do control space to complete that. And now this is pretty simple. We can take this logic and move it into here. And the difference between doing this and this is that the command will not even show up when they try doing slash weapon. Like they cannot run it at all. So that's why setting the condition in this way is pretty helpful. So before I was doing has permission on the player object directly, but you don't actually have to. You can do it on any sender. So we can do if sender.has permission, and then we can just steal this part like that, and then we can just say return true if they have permission, otherwise return false if they don't have permission. And then you can simplify this if you want to, like that. So not only have we simplified our code, but now we can make it so that the command doesn't show up to them at all if they do not have permission to run the command. So let's try this out. All right, back in the server. So if I do slash weapon, I do not have it anymore. So I can't even run it no matter what. And that's something that is also important to mention. Since we're using Minestom, nothing is saved automatically. So whenever you give a player a permission and then you do something like restart the server, it will not be persistent. So you have to come up with your own way of saving permissions for players and stuff like that. You have to come up with your own system. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But for now, let's give ourselves the permission again. So it's just weapon. And then now we can run it. Boom. I did just realize though, it doesn't show up when you try running it like here on the autocomplete. I don't know why that is, but if any of you know why that is, then please let me know. But we can definitely run it now, which is good. Okay, so now that we're aware that the permissions are not saved persistently when you restart the server, but also when you rejoin, that's an issue, right? Because obviously in a Minecraft server, we want players to still have their permissions when they join the server. So we need to come up with our own way of saving our permissions. And then when the player joins the server, we need to retrieve them from wherever we're saving it and then give them the permissions automatically so they can do whatever they were able to do before, okay? Now there's different ways to do all of this, of course, just like anything. I'm just going to come up with my own sort of simple, naive solution, just so that you can see an example of one way you could do this, and then you can probably come up with your own solution that probably works a lot better or performs better. What I'll be doing is showing you guys how to save permissions persistently using JSON. So we're gonna have a JSON file called like permissions.json. All of our permissions will be saved in that file for every player. And then that way, if we assign a permission to a player, it saves into that file persistently. So if they leave and rejoin or anything like that, they will still have the permission. We can just read the file and give it back to them, okay? Like I was saying, it doesn't have to be JSON. It can be YML. It can be a database, like an SQL database or a MongoDB database. It can be literally anything, just as long as you can store these persistently somehow, okay? So with that said, let me show you guys a very basic implementation of this. So let's go ahead and start by sort of modeling how we want our data to be stored. So we're going to make a new file called permissions.json just in our root directory here. And this will be the file that stores all of our player permissions. And I'm assuming you have a basic understanding of what JSON is. It's just a data storage format for text files, basically. So we're going to have an object as the root of this JSON file with a player permissions thingy. And there's going to be an object for that. And then this is essentially going to be a grouping of key value pairs. So for example, we'll have player UUID. So we're going to have the player's UUID. And then we're going to open that up. And then for each of the players, we're going to give them a list of permissions. So, and we can add to this permissions, just any permission, like maybe just weapon, the one that we already have. We can also add, something like commands.star for if we want to give them access to all commands, basically. That's something else that we can add if we want to, just literally whatever, right? So every player is going to have a list of permissions for that player. And that's all we'll have for now. If you want to make this more advanced, you can give players groups as well. So what groups the player is a part of. You can also add a section after player permissions for permission groups. So you can specify different groups that are on the server. And we haven't really talked about groups, so you can really just think of a group as a grouping of permissions with a name. So you can have the admin group, and that can have a bunch of admin related permissions that only admins have access to. You can have the mod group for mod permissions. You can have the player group for just default players on the server that are not like special or anything like that. All the default permissions can be in there. And then what you can do is assign players to groups, and they automatically inherit all the permissions in that group. So that's the concept behind that. I'll show you guys at the end how you can sort of implement that, but for now, we'll just focus on specific players and their permissions, okay? Okay, so now that we've modeled how our JSON file is going to look, we need to figure out a way of actually doing this in Java code, right? And there's different libraries you can use. Two of the popular ones is Jackson and also JSON. So you can choose whatever one you want. I'm just going to go with Jackson. So inside of our Gradle file, we're going to add a new dependency that's going to be specifically for Jackson. There we go. So this will import the Jackson data bind library for us. And basically what this library allows you to do is convert your Java code or Java classes into JSON, and then also process your JSON as Java classes. So you can sort of map it, okay? So make sure you click this to import that dependency. So we're going to make a new package called models. And this is going to store the different classes that we're going to use to sort of model our JSON file or JSON data. So for example, we'll have a permissions file class. And to just explain what we're trying to do here, let me put this on the right side. We're trying to take this JSON file, right, and model it as actual Java classes so that when we use Jackson to convert the JSON into Java, we can easily access it. You don't technically have to do it like this. You can have Jackson technically just grab all the JSON into like a JSON tree type of thing and then parse it that way. But if you do it the way that I'm doing, where you convert it directly into your own Java classes, you can make it easier for yourself and have your data modeled directly into Java. So there's a lot of benefits with that. But like anything, you can do it however you want to. So this Java class that we have here will represent the top level object of this JSON file. So it'll just be literally this and then player permissions. And within player permissions, you have basically a map of player UUIDs and their values. So let me show you what that would look like. So we can do private map, and the key of that map is going to be a string, and then the value of the map will be whatever Java class we use to represent these individual players. So we'll do player permission. We don't have a class for this yet, but we'll leave it like that. And then we'll do player permissions. So hopefully this isn't too confusing. Hopefully it makes sense. But basically we have a map here, and this represents this right here. Okay, so player permissions, that's going to map into this. So basically whenever you get this in Java, whenever you have an object of permission file, within that you'll have a map of player permissions, which just has each player by their UUID and then their permissions. Okay, so let's go and make that class the player permissions class, player permissions. And so this is one single player permission, and we only have one thing inside of that right now, which is just essentially a list of permissions. So we can represent that by doing private set of, we'll just do strings permissions. And you can do a list if you want to. You can do a set, you can do an array probably. But we're doing a set because we want essentially a unique list of permissions. We don't really care for duplicates, just because one permission is going to be the same if it's there twice. So that's that. It's pretty simple. So we're going to go ahead and do code, generate constructor. And usually with libraries like this, you're going to need a default constructor. So that's why we're doing this. And inside of here, we're going to do this dot permissions is equal to new hash set. So that's the default constructor, and then we're going to have a constructor that actually takes in the data. So this here, so it's going to take in a set of permissions and assign it to this variable that we have. And then once we have that, we can now generate our getters and setters. There we go. So we have get permissions and set permissions. So that's all we need to represent basically this object here. And then we can go back to our permissions file class and now import that. And so now we'll just do the same thing for this one. So we're going to make a constructor, just an empty constructor that instantiates this map. So this dot player permissions is equal to new hash map. And then after that, we're going to do code, generate constructor, accept it, and then we'll do our getters and setters. Boom. All right, cool. So now this one again represents this top level one with a single field of player permissions. And of course, if you had a groups one, like I said, in the future, you can just add it as another field of this class here, and that would represent it. Okay, so now that we have our data modeled as Java classes, what we want to do is actually use Jackson to convert our JSON into Java and also our Java into JSON, okay? So what we're going to do is make a new manager in our managers package called the permissions manager. And the purpose of this class will be, as it sounds, to manage all of our permissions related stuff. So the first responsibility of this will be to load our permissions.json file into actual Java objects by mapping it. So we're going to add a public void load data method, and we're going to try attempting to get the file. So file is equal to new file, and then we'll just say permissions.json. And now we can say if file.exists. If the file exists, then now we can go ahead and map it by doing object mapper from Jackson. Object mapper is equal to object mapper. And now we can map it. So we can do permissions file. Permissions file is equal to object mapper.read a value. And there's different ways to do this, but you can just pass our file, and then we can pass the class that we're trying to map it to. So this is basically telling it where to read the data, and this is telling it what to map the data into, which in this case will be our class that we've created, okay? So we also want to catch any exceptions in case it can't map it. So if we define something incorrectly or there's some kind of other exception, we will handle that inside of here. But if the file does not exist and we want to automatically create it, so we're going to make a separate method. So private void create file. We want to do file is equal to new file. And what we want to do is create just an empty version of this. So permissions file is equal to new permissions file, which will just create an object of permissions file with the hash map created but empty. And so what we can do is map that. So object mapper dot write value, pass in the file that we're writing it to, and then pass in the object that we're writing to that file. So once we have taken our permissions file object and wrote it as a permissions.json file, let's go ahead and store this variable right here at the top. So we'll do private permissions file like that. And then down here, we can do this dot permissions file is equal to permissions file, so that in the future we can just automatically grab it. And then now up here, when we're actually trying to load the data and the file does already exist, instead of just having it as a local variable, we can go ahead and do this dot permissions file. So now once we're done loading it, we can then access this permissions file object at any time to get the permissions for a player, okay? Okay, so with this, we now have a way of loading data to our permissions file object, and also if it doesn't already exist, we're going to go ahead and create it. So then we could still add data to it, which is great. So now we need a way to actually, use this object that we have here, add players to it, add permissions to those players and stuff like that, okay? So we're just going to make a method here, public void add permission to player. So what this will do is take in a UUID, a player's identifier that every player has, and then also take in just a permission that we want to add to the data. So the first thing that we want to do is try attempting to get a player. So this would be trying to access the player permissions map by the UUID, by the string UUID, and just try and see if there's already a player permissions object in there. If there's not, obviously we want to create one, okay? So we can do var player permissions is equal to permissions file dot get player permissions, which is our map, dot get, and then we could do uuid dot toString. So what this will do is attempt to get it. If it does not exist, it will be null. So we can do if player permissions is equal to null. Then we want to go and do player permissions is equal to new player permissions. We're creating a new one, but we need to actually put this object into our player permissions file, right? So we can do permissions file dot get player permissions, the map dot put, and then we're going to do uuid dot toString, and then player permissions. So that will add our new player permissions object into our map. And then now at this point, since we do have a player permissions no matter what, we can do player permissions dot get permissions to get the set of all the players permissions dot add permission, the one that we passed in. Okay, and then finally we need to save the data into the JSON file. Okay, that's telling us that we can replace this with a single map compute if absent method call. So that will simplify it looks like. So it's going to try getting it, and if it doesn't exist, it's going to go ahead and create a new one. So I guess that makes sense. So that brings us to the save the data into the JSON file, because we have added it to our Java object, right? But that's just in memory. We want to actually save that persistently in a JSON file. That's the whole point of doing this. We're going to need a method for that. We're going to call it public void save data. So this will do something very similar to what we did when we created the file originally. This time we're just going to override what's already there and save it. We're going to try doing object mapper.write value file and then this .permissions file. So take our permissions file object and write it into the permissions.json file, and then we'll just, for debugging purposes, say data saved successfully. So hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. So now we can go ahead and call that by doing this .save data within here. Every time we do that, we're going to override our current JSON file with the new data. Realistically, you may not want to do it every single time, or maybe you want to set a timer so it does it every so often. That depends on how you're going to design this. And then we'll just make another version of this that will remove a player permission. So public void remove permission from player. So this will take in basically the same exact stuff. So the UUID of the player and then their permission that we're trying to remove. So we're going to attempt to get the player permissions from the permissions file. So permissions file.get player permissions.get UUID.toString. If it does not exist, then there's nothing to remove, right? So we can just go ahead and return. If it does exist, then we want to do player permissions.get permissions.remove permission, just like that. And then we could do save data because we've just modified our data, so we want to save it persistently. All right, so now I think these methods that we have here is a good starting point to actually test this out. First, we need to figure out when we're going to call load data. Ideally, we want to call this when the server starts up for the first time. So we could call it either in our main method or actually just create a constructor for this entire class and then just call it inside the constructor. So then wherever we instantiate this, which is going to be the main method, it will automatically load the data as well, okay? So let's go to our main method, and where we have our manager, we're going to add another manager called the permissions manager is equal to new permissions manager. Oops, permissions manager, like that. So now when we instantiate this object here, this class, it's automatically going to load all the data if it can. So by the time we actually use this manager, it will already be ready to go. We can extract and add whatever data we want to it. So for add permission to player, we want to call this one inside of our add permission command, because currently we are adding, we're taking in a permission when you run the command, we're adding it to the player, but we're not saving that persistently. So not only do we want to add it to the player when we run the command, but we also want to add it to our permissions manager, which will then also save it to our JSON file, okay? So we need to figure out a way to get our permissions manager inside of this, and it's actually really easy. All we got to do, as we learned about before, is just pass in the permissions manager to the constructor. And then now inside of here, we can do permissions manager dot add permission to player. We can do player dot get UUID and then the permission itself. So permission name. And that's it. That's literally all you got to do. And then now whenever we instantiate our add permission command inside of our main method, all we got to do is pass in our permissions manager, which we already did above. We also have our remove permission method here. So we're just going to add another command, remove permissions. All right, here's the command. It's pretty simple, just like the other one. We're just going to have them pass in a permission, and then we're going to grab it when they run the command properly, and then we'll just remove it by doing player.remove permission. You just do the same exact thing as when you add it as well, and then we can also call the permission manager remove permission from player method to remove it from our JSON file. Okay, so that should be all we need to test this out. What we're going to do is boot up the server, and it should automatically create our permissions.json file for us. And then we're also going to try adding and removing permissions from my player to see if it modifies the file correctly. Let's go ahead and just delete the file that we already have, like that, and let's try it out. Okay, so now it's not showing up here. The server is running, but I think that's just my IDE. So if I just open an Explorer, we just open this up, we can now see that we have the permissions.json file, so we can open that up. And look at that, now we have our top level permissions file object, and we have our permission, and then we have our player permissions map, but it's just empty right now. So it was able to create the file successfully, which is a great sign. So now let's go back to the server and try this out. So we're going to do add permission. We're going to say potato. So we're going to give ourselves the player potato permission. And if we just open up the file inside of our IDE, now that that's showing up, you can do Control-Alt-L to format it so it's easier to look at. And if we scroll down here, we can see that it has added our player by our UUID as well as the permission, which is freaking awesome. So we can just keep adding whatever we want to this. And also because it's a set, if we add the same permission multiple times, it should only appear once, which is great. So if you could do Control-Alt-L, there we go. So we only have the 3 permissions, not this one multiple times. And we can also remove the permissions. So let's try removing potato. So remove permission potato. And boom, now potato is gone. So freaking awesome. Now we have a way of storing permissions persistently. So every time we modify a player's permissions by adding or removing, we are saving that to our JSON file. So now the whole point of this though is that we want to make it so that if the player leaves the server and joins back, they still have all their permissions. So we have achieved the first part of this, which is actually storing the permissions. Now we need to load them and give them to the player when they join the server so they have their permissions when they come back. So in the last episode, we created this player event listener, which is a event node that allows us to give a player a skin or a disguise when they join back on the server. So what we can do is actually just use one of these here to give the player their permissions when they're joining. We can just go ahead and do it in our async player configuration event. I think that kind of makes sense. You're configuring the player, so we can also configure their permissions. So right after we set where they're going to spawn, we can also add their permissions to them. I don't know if that sounds weird, but yeah, let's go ahead and get an instance of our permissions manager inside of here. So permissions manager, and now we can use permissions manager, and we just need to add a method that can get a player's permissions. So let's go back to our permissions manager and create one. Permissions, we're going to pass in the UID of the player, and now we want to get the player permissions if it exists, and if it does, now we can just simply return player permissions dot get permissions like that. Although if this is null, meaning that it does not exist, this will give a null exception. So we want to do if player permissions is equal to null, let's just going to return an empty hash set. So new hash set, so they have no permissions. So now we can go back here and do permissions manager dot get permissions, pass in the UID of the player that we're trying to get permissions for. So player dot get UID. And now since this returns a set, we can do dot for each. And for each of the permissions, this is just a permission string. So for each of the permissions, we can now add that to the player one by one. So we can go ahead and do player.add permission, new permission, permission string, just like that. And that's literally it. So now when the player joins the server, we're going to get all of their persistently stored permissions and then give it back to the player so that no matter how many times they leave and rejoin, they will still have all the permissions that they need, okay? One thing that we need to do is add our permissions manager as a input to this constructor, and now let's go ahead and try this out. Okay, so when I join the server, I do not have access to the weapon command, right? But if I do add permission weapon, that will give it to me, and I can do /weapon now, like that. So let's try rejoining, and now if I do /weapon, I can do it. And if we check our permissions.json file, we can see that we have our weapon permission. So I can also remove it. So if I do remove permission weapon, that, and then if I rejoin, it's not going to be given back to me, so I can't run the command anymore. So I don't know about you guys, but I think that's pretty freaking awesome. We have now successfully created a very basic permissions system to store permissions persistently and also make it so that players can leave and join the server and still have all the permissions that we have given them. Now, with all the examples I've shown you today, I've only done it with commands, right? But like I said before, you can do permissions with literally anything that involves a player. So if a player tries breaking a block, for example, you can add a permission check to the block break listener so that if they don't have the permission, it will cancel the event so that it doesn't break the block. If they do have the break block permission, it will break it for them, okay? So that's something that you can add if you want to. Another thing that I told you about before is the concept of permission groups. Currently we have our player permissions, but then after that we have a group of, or a object of permission groups, which has a bunch of groups within it. So we have the admin group, we have the moderator group, we have the player group. The admin group has children, so these are child groups. So you can have a group that has groups within it, so all those permissions are combined. And then you also have permissions per group. So the admin group has 2 permissions, admin.star and also game mode. And then since the admin group has a child of moderator, it would also inherit this permission here. And then since moderator has a child of player, it would also inherit all these permissions here. So that's what that would look like in JSON. And then all you would have to do is modify your class here to store the permissions group map as well. And then we just have to create another class for that. So the permissions group class, which has children, as you saw, and also permissions, okay? So then once you have that, you can model your JSON as Java code, of course. So then in your permissions manager, you just need to add more methods to that. So like adding a player to a group, getting all of the group's permissions, and you need to make sure that you recursively check every single child group as well to get all the permissions and combine them together. You need to also modify get player permissions to not only get the player's personal permissions that they have, but also get the permissions of all the groups that they're a part of. So there's that element to it as well. So I'll have all of the code for this in the description below, even with all the group stuff, so you can check it out if you want to. But hopefully you learned a lot in this episode. Now you guys know how to add permissions to a player, check permissions on a player, and also store and load permissions in a persistent manner using JSON. So hopefully you found this video valuable, and I'll see you guys next time. So that's it for this video, everybody. I really hope you learned something new. If you liked the video, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Make sure to also check the description below for important links to code and other resources, but also really important, join our Discord. We have a big community of over 5,000 programmers, and it's a place where you can find new friends or get help on any code that you're stuck on. If you want to support what I do on this channel, please consider hitting the join button below, and this will allow you to support my channel for as low as $1 a month, but there are different tiers to choose from if you want to. For anyone that becomes a member on my channel, you get a special rank on my Discord server, early access to new videos, and you can just see yourself on the screen right now. So if that sounds cool to you, feel free to join. If you don't want to, that's fine. If you can't, that's okay too. I really just appreciate you watching the video anyway. Thank you so much. And that's it. Peace.